from the historic campus of Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, where the good, the true, and the beautiful are taught, nurtured, and honored. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, bringing the activity and education of the college to listeners across the country.
Even people who are arguably wrongly accused of being isolationists, most agree that we in fact live in a world that involves global travel, communication, international relationship, foreign exchange. Those are all goods that I think most Americans enjoy and want to see continue. They want to see them continue in a way that is economically feasible, secure, safe, and good.
This is your host, Scot Bertram. Welcome to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. That was Dr. Jason Gehrke, Assistant Professor of History at Hillsdale College. We'll talk in depth with him later on about his recent essay, America First, the Iran Strike and Current U.S. Strategy. Also joining us in this week of Veterans Day, Dr. Mark Moyar, Chair of Military History here at Hillsdale College. We talk more about the Vietnam War at 50. And Dr. Tom Connor, Professor Emeritus of History at Hillsdale. He'll take us on a tour of Luxembourg American Cemetery. First, we're joined by Dr. Mark Moyar. He is William P. Harris Chair of Military History here at Hillsdale College. Also the author of a pair of books on Vietnam, Triumph Forsaken, Triumph Regained. A third is on the way. You can find his website, markmoyar.com. Mark, thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be with you again, Scott.
Talking about 50 years since the end of the Vietnam War, the U.S. pulled out in the fall of Saigon, in fact. And you wrote a piece for the Washington Examiner, 50 years on, remembering the fall of Saigon. Looking back, 5 decades later now, who would you identify as most responsible for the fall of South Vietnam? Congress, White House, someone else? Who's most responsible?
Yes, that's an excellent question and a complicated one, and something I'm actually in the middle of researching. But I think the primary responsibility goes to Congress because they are the ones who were consistently cutting funding, and ultimately at the end we were at a place where it looked like South Vietnam could persist with continued funding, and they decided that they were going to cut it off. Now there is some responsibility also for Nixon and Kissinger. I think Kissinger more so than Nixon, because Kissinger was, I think, overeager to try to pull out quickly and make concessions because he viewed himself as being this great statesman who had achieved this opening with China and the Soviet Union, but wasn't really able to actually get the cooperation from China and the Soviet Union that he had hoped for. But I think even without their mistakes, it's ultimately Congress pulling the plug. Now, of course, that's also somewhat related to Watergate, which is Nixon's fault as well, because that contributes to this decline in support.
Kissinger made a deal in 1973, pulled out U.S. troops, let North Vietnamese troops stay, knowing what we knew at that time. Was that a reasonable compromise?
A lot of people think he gave too much, and I'm inclined to agree with that position, because for a long time that was a part of the U.S. negotiating position, that we were going to insist that there be mutual withdrawal of troops. And a lot of his critics, people who worked with him, thought he had just given that away. And we were in a position of strength when this deal's being negotiated because we'd just undertaken the Christmas bombing, and we could have extracted more. But he was just so desperate. And, of course, this is something we see again and again with diplomats, is oftentimes they're just so desperate for some sort of great deal. And, he ends up winning the Nobel Peace Prize. But, you end up giving away too much.
Yeah. You say in this essay at the Washington Examiner that South Vietnam's military was performing well even after the U.S. left. Do you think they could have held on if Congress hadn't cut off aid, as you mentioned earlier? Was the collapse more about money, funding, and supplies than the fighting ability of the South Vietnamese troops?
Yeah, I do think they could have hung on, and they fought off this big offensive in 1972 without American ground forces. Now, there was American air power there at the time, but you don't just defeat 14 enemy divisions with air power. And they were also building their own air power. And I think the North Vietnamese were testing them at the end of 1974 to see what kind of response would happen if they undertook a new offensive. And you have a combination of, Nixon had promised to come to their aid, but he couldn't because of Watergate. He's gone. And then also you have this cut in U.S. support. The South Vietnamese don't have fuel or ammunition or bombs or the things they need to maintain their defense.
Do you think that American politicians and Democrats, certainly too, turned against South Vietnam partly to hurt President Nixon? What's Nixon's sort of his role in the calculus of what happened?
Yeah, I do think that plays a role, especially among some of the moderates who end up turning against the funding for the war. Now, the left and liberals were already opposed to the war and trying to get out long before Watergate. Mm-hmm. So it would be too simple to say this was simply because of Watergate. And, some of them were already opposed to the war in 1968. And, a number of them had actually kind of kept quiet because they were in LBJ's party. And then once Nixon comes in, some of them become more vocal. But there is this strong opposition that is building. Now, there's also a part of the problem for Nixon is that in 1973, it comes to light that he had misled Congress about the bombing of Cambodia. And so there's also some trust issues there.
Mark Moyar with us. He is William P. Harris Chair of Military History here at Hillsdale College, talking about his essay, 50 Years On, Remembering the Fall of Saigon. And should mention that just recently here on campus, we had a gathering, some lectures about this topic, and you can find them at the Freedom Library. If you search Hillsdale College Freedom Library, you'll see the videos. Who spoke at the conference?
Yeah, so we had a lot of the leading historians of what you might call the revisionist school of the history of the Vietnam War, which views this in, I think, essentially the same terms as Ronald Reagan, that this was a noble cause, that we actually had good reasons to fight, but we fought the war the wrong way. So we started off with James Wilbanks, who's taught it for many years at the Army Command Staff College, has written quite a few books, actually fought in the war, including at the Battle of An Loc in 1972. We had Jay Veith, who has written the best book on the fall of Saigon called Black April. Mm-hmm. We had John Del Vecchio, who is one of the leading novelists of the war, but was also a veteran. He wrote The 13th Valley and Carry Me Home and For the Sake of All Living Things. And then we had a panel with several people, including Professor Bill McClay of Hillsdale, and Andrew Finlayson, another veteran. We had the author of The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Vietnam War, Phil Jennings. Mm-hmm. I also spoke there and gave a talk as well. But as you said, it was a great event, all-day event, and people can see it now online.
Yep. Search Hillsdale College Freedom Library. You'll see that pop up and can see all the videos from that conference. The United States helped remove South Vietnam's first president based partly on reporting from journalists like David Halberstam, as you point out in this essay at the Examiner. Was that a mistake that was driven somewhat by cultural misunderstanding?
Yes, it was very much driven by cultural misunderstanding. What you had was internal opposition to the South Vietnamese government. And for one thing, Americans, many of them didn't understand at the time that this was actually being supported by the communists, who are our mortal enemies, but they're trying to make it look like this is some kind of grassroots opposition. Mm-hmm. And so that's part of the misunderstanding. And then partly, too, the Americans thought that you should not interfere with these kind of demonstrations against the government, no matter how flagrant they are. But clearly, in the Vietnamese context, just about everyone recognized that at some point, the government cannot simply tolerate these massive insults and challenges to its authority. And so they do sort of break up the demonstration. Now, they're not gunning down people. This is in Tiananmen Square. But in fact, the South Vietnamese generals actually support this. But some Americans think, well, this is not how you would do things in America. We don't like this. And then to make matters even worse, we end up actually supporting a coup by the generals who backed this idea, because we got wrong. At least some people didn't understand who was supporting this. It was really a terrible debacle. And really, I think the most important mistake of the war, because I think the war mean, you maybe don't even ever have American troops going into Vietnam if Diem is not overthrown.
You suggest to the essay, too, that Americans often can misjudge foreign allies and enemies because we assume everyone thinks like us. What are the risks of that kind of thinking?
Yeah, well, it results in bad policies. We've seen it again in Iraq and Afghanistan. We thought that these people would embrace democracy and would fight for it, and we invest very heavily in these countries and their governments, and it turned out not to work as we had hoped. And part of what's great about America is we have these universal ideals, and those ideas have spread to other countries, which is in general a positive thing. But reality is they haven't spread to some places, and if we try to just assume they have, we're going to find ourselves making more mistakes and getting into more trouble.
You also argue that abandoning Vietnam encouraged the Soviet Union to spread communism elsewhere. Were those revolutions likely to happen anyway, or do you really see them as a direct result of our actions?
Well, in many of the cases in the the late 70s, there have been communist rebellions going on in these places, but a lot of them don't have the strength on their own to make a difference. Mm-hmm. And so they need weapons, they need advisors. I mean, you have Cuban advisors and Soviet advisors going all over the place in the late 70s. And of course, even in Vietnam, there never would have been a serious threat to U.S. interests if China and the Soviet Union hadn't been sending in huge amounts of aid. So they were really the key enablers in most of these places.
Finally, in this essay at the Washington Examiner, you say that peace deals are only workable if they're protected from U.S. political changes, that there's some guarantee that they'll actually be carried out. Is that possible given our politics, our democracy? How can any one president make sure the next one doesn't undo those foreign policy achievements?
Yeah, well, there is, and certainly in our system of government, you're always going to have changes in parties. And so we've, unfortunately seen that our country's been fickle. And I think we saw that again in Afghanistan, where you saw the Biden administration, precipitously ending this long period of involvement. There are some things that, may even be beyond your control. But, I think when you think about these deals, you do have to factor in what might happen if the other party comes in. Mm-hmm. Is this sustainable? And if you think they're not going to sustain it, maybe you make a different choice, or maybe you try to make changes to the situation that, can't be rolled back. So one example currently, you could argue, how are we going to have an enduring policy in Ukraine? Maybe we give them a lot more weaponry, maybe even nuclear weapons, so that even if the next administration is not as supportive, they've already got these assets that will ensure they can protect themselves.
Mark Moyar is William P. Harris Chair of Military History here at Hillsdale College, also the author of Triumph Forsaken and Triumph Regained. You can read this essay at the Washington Examiner's website, 50 Years On, Remembering the Fall of Saigon. And Mark's website is markmoyar.com. Mark, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
Up next, Dr. Jason Gehrke from Hillsdale's History Department talks about his recent essay on America First, the Iran strike and current U.S. strategy. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
This show is a part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. If you like what you hear, please subscribe to your favorite. You'll get brand new episodes of all your favorite shows sent right to your device, and you'll help us know that you're out there listening. Never miss another episode by going to podcast.hillsdale.edu/subscribe. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu/subscribe. Or click the follow or subscribe button on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube.
Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Be sure to check out the Hillsdale College Podcast Network at podcast.hillsdale.edu for older episodes of this program, plus other great Hillsdale College audio. We're joined by Dr. Jason Gehrke. He is Assistant Professor of History here at Hillsdale College, also Associate Director of the Center for Military History and Strategy. Dr. Gehrke, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Scott.
Talking today about an essay you wrote over at realcleardefense.com. It's titled America First, the Iran Strike and Current U.S. Strategy. You open the essay by saying that critics of the foreign policy of President Trump equate America First with isolationism. Why do you think that misconception persists? How do you distinguish America First and that policy from perhaps isolationism or traditional interventionism?
Yeah, Scott, thanks. That's a really important question. We have to start really by defining terms. So the terms isolationism and interventionism, those are mainly terms that people use to describe the positions they dislike. There are very few people who say, hello, I'm an interventionist, for example. But those ideas really go back arguably to the early 20th century when there was resistance to America's involvement in World War II. And the term America First came in part to critique that intervention or that involvement. And you can see how these terms can become changed around here. Mm-hmm. But there can be the idea then that America First means that the United States should simply withdraw from its role in the world, not have any kind of international or diplomatic relationships, should somehow take safe haven behind 3,500 miles of ocean and plan that it will somehow be fine. I don't actually think a lot of people hold that view, and I don't think it's consistent with the kind of policy we're seeing presently from the administration, or frankly articulated by the vice president in some of his major public statements.
Vice President Vance's Naval Academy address looms large in your essay. What do you see as the key principles that he laid out, and how do they transfer into actual policy choices?
Yeah, I think Vice President's Naval Academy address is a really important statement, and maybe one that was underplayed even in the media at the time. If you read that address, you see the Vice President referring again and again to something like a principled, interest-based foreign policy. The point he's making to the grads is that the current administration and hopefully future administrations, in his view, will use American military power towards military combat-oriented ends. They'll use them to defend tangible, identifiable, and I think the key thought here is limited military interests, rather than use the military as an instrument for some kind of transformative work. In that address, it seems fair to say that you hear the vice president echoing what have been for many, and this is still a contested question, but nonetheless, for many, the lesson of the recent war in Afghanistan and arguably of the Vietnam War, namely that when the U.S. military is drawn into lengthy nation-building operations that becomes bogged down, we turn into a quagmire and see something like the withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021. Whether or not that's the right lesson to learn from Afghanistan is still very much a debate. It's ongoing in the literature. But nonetheless, I think the administration is taking that lesson and attempting to signal a difference.
Dr. Jason Gehrke is with us. His essay over at realcleardefense.com, America First, the Iran Strike and Current U.S. Strategy. You talk about the reassertion of the nation state as the primary actor in geopolitics. Why is that so central to America First, and how might it change the way the U.S. deals with both allies and rivals?
Yeah, well, I think that's an implication of the language you see in the Naval Academy address, as well as some of the moves the administration has made. What am I drawing a distinction with there? Again, by one account, as the leader of a large coalition of alliances, the United States presumptively has worked through and in the interest of that broad coalition or alliance, as opposed to working with either with individual countries or working unilaterally, although often it has done things that look effectively unilateral, or again, not interacting with powers globally that for whatever reason have been identified as rogue or adversarial. It seems to me that we've seen in both administrations under the current president a willingness to act on our own discretion, irrespective of criticism particularly from Europe, I think. And secondly, to engage with countries, say, like Iran, or to some extent, Saudi Arabia, with whom the United States has had a long relationship towards limited and particular policies. So the implication there is, well, there's a couple of questions. On the one hand, the question is, does this mean that the United States is in fact withdrawing from its identity in the 20th century in the post-World War II Cold War era as the leader of the NATO-European alliance, and to some extent then ceding its independence or autonomy to that coalition-built body of interests? That's one thing. The other question is, does this mean that the United States is moving away from a kind of foreign policy which aims explicitly to secure or extend American values? If you begin to use the language of realism, and to some extent the Naval Academy address does that as well, it raises questions about how both our NATO allies, our European partners, but also countries around the world should predict or expect U.S. actions.
Let's talk about the Iran strike, this attempt to disable or destroy the nuclear program in that country. Some would say it's a break from restraint. You say it's consistent with the administration's record. Can you walk us through why you see it fitting into this America First framework?
Again, by one account, if America First means withdrawing from the 20th century, or what some see as a 20th century tendency to become involved in wars around the world, from Truman to the Vietnam War to Afghanistan, arguably. If America First means withdrawing military action globally in order to shift American focus, American interest, American resources, then something like the Iran strike, something like the strike against the Houthis looks like the opposite of that. It looks like sending U.S. personnel, weapons, and equipment into foreign places. On the other hand, this president in both administrations has shown a willingness to use combat power in specific situations to bring about specific or stated ends. There are some who criticize that as well. Some who say, well, that action is really using American power to beat up those people who can't retaliate in really significant ways. So there's always some other voice in the conversation. Nonetheless, you see from perhaps what listeners will remember best from the Soleimani strike, for example, up until even this most recent strike, a consistent pattern of making a claim, making a threat, acting on that threat if the outcome that's desired is not, if you don't get the response from that the president is looking for. So in that sense, you have, on the one hand, a clear limitation to the extension of American power. And on the other hand, I don't think we've ever heard a statement from the administration that suggests that American military power is off the table as an instrument of foreign policy.
You write in the piece that the administration wants capable rather than merely cultural allies. How might we think about what makes an ally capable, and perhaps which nations fit that description today?
Yeah, well, what I was getting at there is the point of diplomatic and military alliances is that they extend your global power. They augment what you can do on your own and provide critical resources. If you have alliances that, in fact, can't contribute tangible military, economic, and personnel resources to some critical effort, then you don't have alliances so much as you have obligations. A famous case of this, arguably, is Hannibal on the Italian peninsula in the 3rd century in the Punic Wars. So I think there's a real effort to, in fact, this is an uncontested point, but there's a strong effort on the part of the administration to move our European allies in particular, the NATO alliance in particular, to in fact be ready and capable of fielding lethal, formidable combat forces. That involves increasing their commitments to defense spending, increasing the size of their militaries, increasing their combat readiness. The distinction there then between capable and cultural is for me simply that broadly we have economic relationships with the European Union and with the countries that are in NATO. We've had a kind of public, even moral voice since the end of World War II. But if it comes to the point that adversaries think that that's mainly all talk, then that alliance is a paper tiger. It seems fair to describe the administration's efforts as attempting to rejuvenate that, even if through tough love or at least tough rhetoric in a number of places.
Talking with Dr. Jason Gehrke, Assistant Professor of History here at Hillsdale, also author of the essay at RealClearDefense.com, America First, the Iran Strike and Current U.S. Strategy. There is a sense sometimes of unpredictability in American actions. Is that a feature? Are there features that we gain from that unpredictability?
Like always, it's a debated point. Arguably, yes. If you're unpredictable, then your adversary can't presume that his own actions are safe, can't presume that he knows exactly what you're going to do. Unpredictability can force a global community to pay more attention on the one hand, and can open up your range of options for different kinds of action. So that's helpful, potentially. It can also scare your friends.
Mm-hmm.
I was looking for a nicer word than scare, but it can raise questions.
Yeah.
And I think we have seen European allies to some extent raising these questions, but does this new look, if you call it that way, does this mean that the U.S. is with us or not? Can we, in fact, no longer rely upon this sort of bedrock U.S. allied relationship?
Mm-hmm.
By definition, unpredictable will provoke some of those questions, and the long-term effects of any given policy really depend on its execution over time.
Let's return to the Iran strike for a bit. You connect in this piece the Iran strike to a larger strategic goal of deterring China. How does weakening Iran in this way support the U.S. in that region?
Right. Well, it may or may not. I should be fair. But if you look at the consistent public statements of the administration, and really this is now across administrations for the last, say, decade, there's a recognition of something called the return to great power competition, and a recognition that the People's Republic of China is, sometimes we hear it called our pacing threat,
Mm-hmm.
Which is to say, if there's a true near-peer rival, the defense policy, defense and intellectual community uniformly regards that as China. One of the concerns that you see then is the nation's readiness to deter or meet China in conflict. And that is really a question of resources and focus. It is very difficult to manage a conflict on the continent of Europe, a conflict in the Middle East. We still had it going, a conflict in Afghanistan, the global counterterrorism threat that remains, concern on the high seas, and our long-term policy of strategic ambiguity with Taiwan, and thus also China. So potentially decisively handling since 1979, the enduring Iranian threat of nuclear power, of closing the Strait of Hormuz, settling the situation in the Middle East, particularly with the Iran threat, arguably creates a context in which the United States is free to focus on what is the more decisive long-term situation. Of course, that depends on the ultimate outcome of the Iran strike, but that there does seem something consistent from a strategic level here. On the one hand, pushing the Europeans to be able to handle Europe, helping to set conditions that allow effectively Israel to police the Middle East, and thus freeing U.S. forces to be focused on the kind of long-term investment and force transformation that is necessary to compete with China in the Indo-Pacific.
In the time leading up to the strike in Iran, we heard some predictions. If you do this, Iran will do X, Russia will do Y, China will do this. It seems many of those predictions have not come true in these months since the strike. What else might we look for in the coming months to judge whether this strike advanced the strategic goals of the country?
I guess there are a few things. One will be the ongoing assessment of the degree to which the strikes were successful. Certainly we know to some extent they were successful, but there was at the time, and there will continue to be, an argument about whether or not there are other enrichment facilities or other stockpiles of nuclear material. I'm not sure we actually know the answer to that question, but one major measure will be the degree to which Iran's ability to threaten the world with a nuclear weapon, or nearly having a nuclear weapon, is no longer an effective instrument of their course of policy.
Mm-hmm.
That'll be a major thing. It was the primary objective of the strike, and removing the possibility of a nuclear Iran, at least for some range of time, is of strategic value. There was talk, I think, at the time, mainly hopeful and perhaps misguided of hope for regime change in Iran as a result. I don't think we've seen that. And I think we have enough experience now to know that regime change is always, be careful what you wish for. Mm-hmm. Regime change brings its own kinds of problems, whether you're talking about Syria or you're talking about Iraq or Afghanistan. So I'm not certain that if we were to see a regime change scenario, that I don't think anyone thinks that's happening now, if that would be a good or not. Mm-hmm. But in the longer term, then, the inability of the regime in Iran to threaten U.S. and allied commercial interests, the inability of them to threaten nuclear strike, whether it's against the United States or near allies, those are the kinds of things that will indicate in the longer term if there's been an enduring effect from that event.
Let's close with this with Dr. Jason Gehrke from Hillsdale's History Department. This essay over at realcleardefense.com as we sort of synthesize this for an America First foreign policy that we outlined earlier. What does success look like for that kind of foreign policy 10 or 20 years from now?
10 or 20 years from now, I think it looks like a major military conflict with China over Taiwan and the Taiwan Strait does not happen. It looks like the security of commercial shipping interests, no fear of commercial vessels being destroyed or raided or hijacked. It looks like an end to the war in Ukraine, mm-hmm. which preserves innocent life and leads to the continuation of a stable order of friendship in that part of the world. It looks like a world in which U.S. forces are properly funded, trained, disciplined, and prepared to execute actions that are in the interest of the United States and its allies. And on the other hand, does not involve the kind of permanent efforts that ultimately undermine the unity of the country behind its own military actions or sap its domestic and economic resources. So in that sense, I'd point out that the soul of the kind of limited or particular use of military power that I think the administration is signaling is nonetheless also does not involve a definition of success that involves the country simply withdrawn entirely from the world. I think most agree, even people who are arguably wrongly accused of being isolationist, mm-hmm. most agree that we in fact live in a world that involves global travel, communication, international relationship, foreign exchange. Those are all goods that I think most Americans enjoy and want to see continue. Mm-hmm. They want to see them continue in a way that is economically feasible, secure, safe, and good.
Dr. Jason Gehrke is Assistant Professor of History at Hillsdale College, also Associate Director of the Center for Military History and Strategy. You can read his essay at realcleardefense.com, America First, the Iran Strike and Current U.S. Strategy. Dr. Gehrke, thanks for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
God, thanks so much for having me.
Up next, Dr. Tom Connor, Professor Emeritus of History here at Hillsdale College, will take us on a tour of Luxembourg American Cemetery. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. It's no secret that Americans are more divided than ever. And it's not just over what policies will improve our great country. No, it's over whether America is great at all, whether America deserves our love. That's why Imprimis is so important. Imprimis looks at the issues of the day from a constitutional perspective, reminding citizens always of our great heritage of liberty. For more than 50 years, Imprimis has featured speeches from the smartest conservative thinkers and writers at Hillsdale events. These days, Hillsdale publishes people like Molly Hemingway, Andy Puzder, Harmeet Dillon, and Chris Rufo. Over 6.4 million American households and businesses receive Imprimis absolutely free. And I urge you to sign up for it today at no charge. To get your free lifetime subscription, go to hillsdale.edu/lifetime right now. Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Be sure to check us out on X. Follow for updated show and guest information. We're at Hillsdale Radio and the podcast network at HC Podcasts. We're joined by Dr. Tom Cotter, former professor of history at Hillsdale College and now professor emeritus, also author of War and Remembrance, the story of the American Battle Monuments Commission. Dr. Cotter, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
We've been spending this series taking a look at a number of the American cemeteries in Europe and some of the stories that can be found in War and Remembrance, and telling them here. We tackle Luxembourg American Cemetery today. Before really get into it, tell people where Luxembourg is. It's not one of the more prominent European countries. It's smaller than most. Where's Luxembourg?
Yeah, indeed. It is a very small country. It's kind of nestled in between Belgium and France and Germany, and Holland is very close too. So it's a Grand Duchy. The head of state is either a Grand Duke or a Grand Duchess. And it's got a parliamentary system as well as one of the charter members of NATO and also the European Union. So it's a significant country for being as small as it is. It's one of the most affluent countries in Europe to this day as well.
So if you visit Luxembourg American Cemetery, you would probably first see this very impressive memorial chapel. Very detailed. What would you see there? Yes,
when one comes in from the parking area, that is the first thing. The chapel rests. It's a centerpiece of a relatively open area that is above in elevation the actual graves area. But the chapel's more than 50 feet high, and it's got a very prominent sculpture. The angel of death, angel of mercy, and that actually is on the facade that faces the graves area. And there are panels explaining a little bit about the cemetery and the other cemeteries that can be seen in Europe and around the world. So, but then the graves area opens up. There are over 5,000 burials in that cemetery, and from that landing in front of the chapel, one can take in that entire panorama.
Many buried here at Luxembourg lost their lives in the Battle of the Bulge, which I think just last year recently was the 75th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge. Briefly, go on this for a while, the significance of the Battle of the Bulge.
Well, it's known as the Battle of the Bulge to Americans because what happened was in the middle of December 1944, those who know the timeline of World War II in Europe know that that's just 6 months before VE Day, before the war was wrapped up. But the Germans, Adolf Hitler, read that. It was a desperation move on his part, but he launched a counterattack from essentially the other side of the German border through the Ardennes forest. And his troops were aiming at the very important port of Antwerp up in Belgium. And if the Germans had actually gotten there, they would have driven a wedge between the British forces who were farther north and the Americans who were farther south. The front was moving from west to east toward Germany, and Dwight Eisenhower, of course, was the supreme commander. His concept was to advance upon Germany in a unified front. And what the Germans were trying to do was drive a wedge between them. All the Germans were able to produce was a bulge. They never got all the way to Antwerp, but they produced a bulge because initially, due to weather largely and surprise as well, they caught the Americans back on their heels. And for the first week or so of the battle, the Germans pretty much had their way. But when the weather cleared, the movie Patton tells this story really quite well and quite accurately. When the weather cleared and Patton moved troops up from about 50 or 60 miles south in a most amazing winter march, the Americans and the British eventually began hammering away at this bulge, and it took them 6 weeks to restore the line to what it had been. And in the meantime, the Germans had lost about a quarter of their available strength in the West, which they could never replace. And the Americans had suffered the second bloodiest battle in American history.
And not that any part of the war or any war is to be envied, but this in particular was brutal fighting in this battle. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Largely because we were surprised we didn't have winter gear for our troops. We were just throwing troops at those of you of your listeners who know the story of Easy Company, Band of Brothers. They were airborne troops, but they were available, so they were thrown into that battle. But they didn't have heavy equipment. They didn't have heavy winter gear, and it was brutally cold, and the terrain was very rugged. And the Germans were in fighting spirit. So, no, it was a pretty awful place to be.
Dr. Tom Connor with us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour talking about Luxembourg American Cemetery. There's a quote from Eisenhower featured here about the sacrifice of military members. What is that quote?
I think I might have it here. Ike sent a message to, I don't know whether it's the same thing, Scott, but this was a standout quote from Eisenhower that I found. The cemetery was dedicated on the 4th of July, 1960. Dwight Eisenhower was in the White House then, but he did not travel to the dedication. But he said this, he said, "I join you in paying proud tribute to the men who sleep in the Luxembourg Cemetery, our comrades in arms in the crusade against tyranny. These died that people might live in freedom and peace. Now they rest forever in the soil of the friendly country which so many of them helped to free from the invader." And I thought there are a number of points in that quote that really encapsulate what the American effort in World War II was all about, and also one of the principles behind the ongoing act of commemoration that the American Battle Monuments Commission wages, namely that the cemeteries are located in friendly countries, and every day that passes, one is reminded of the collaboration, the ongoing friendship between the United States and the host countries, most of which the American forces, of course, liberated during the Second World War.
Now, General Patton is buried here at Luxembourg American Cemetery. Why Luxembourg?
Because Patton's Third Army had a lot to do with the liberation of Luxembourg. In fact, it's credited by the historians and also by the citizens of Luxembourg themselves. Patton's Third Army was their liberators. And Patton died. It's really interesting. It was the 22nd of December, 1944, that Patton launched his strike at one of the bases of the Bulge that the Germans had created with their attack. And a year later, he died on that same day. Died from a broken neck that he'd experienced in a traffic accident collision in Germany. He was buried in the cemetery on Christmas Eve, 1945. And to be buried there answered his wish to lie with his troops. If anything happened to him, he said he wanted to rest forever with his troops.
Dr. Tom Connor, somewhat of a more general question, but you had alluded to this, how the American Battle Monuments Commission is able to run these cemeteries at these various countries. It's a cooperation. So the American Battle Monuments Commission ends up the caretakers, but it's not American soil, right?
That's correct, Scott. And it's interesting in the particular story behind the Luxembourg Cemetery. The government of Luxembourg, reflecting the gratitude that the people of Luxembourg felt toward the Americans for being their liberators, offered a grant of the ground, which the cemetery currently occupies, to the American government as an outright gift. But we turned it down as such because the actual status of the ground is that the government of Luxembourg has ceded that ground to us for the express purpose of maintaining a military cemetery. But the soil, the ground is not considered American soil. And that was the desire of our government because we did not want to have to deal with the principle of extraterritoriality. We didn't want asylum seekers coming to cemeteries, seeking eventual repatriation or movement to the United States. And we also didn't want to have unique responsibility for security. So securing these grounds is a cooperative effort, actually, between local officials and the Americans.
Dr. Tom Cotter, Professor Emeritus at Hillsdale College and author of War and Remembrance, the Story of the American Battle Monuments Commission. Dr. Cotter, thanks for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Pleasure, Scott. Thank you.
That will wrap up this edition of the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Our thanks to Dr. Mark Moyar, William P. Harris Chair of Military History here at Hillsdale, Dr. Jason Gehrke, Assistant Professor of History at Hillsdale, and Dr. Tom Cotter, Professor Emeritus of History at Hillsdale College, on this Veterans Day themed episode of the program. Remember, you can hear new episodes every week on this station. You also can find extended versions of some of our interviews or listen anytime to the podcast. Find it at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. Until next week, I'm Scot Bertram, and this has been the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.